The Psychology of Environmental Sustainability and Justice Relational Summary for Cradle to Cradle, Chapter 6, a relational summary lecture by T.H. Culhane, illustrated by you. Now, in Chapter 6 of McDonough Braungart's book, Cradle to Cradle, Remaking the Way We Make Things, they end the book with what they call 5 steps to eco-effectiveness. Now, these steps make the chapter called Putting Eco-Effectiveness into Practice. And it's clear that because they are architects, designers, and chemists, among other things, the authors are targeting the use of eco-effective thinking in those particular practices. So the book talks about ways of improving the production of cars and carpets, of factories and fabrics, of bread and beef, and other tangible or consumer products. However, as the authors state on page 178, quote, "We are doing more than designing for biological and technical cycles. We are recasting the design assignment. Not design a car, but design a nutri-vehicle. Instead of aiming to create cars with minimal or zero negative emissions, imagine cars designed to release positive emissions and generate other nutritious effects on the environment. The car's engine is treated like a chemical plant modeled on natural systems. Everything the car emits is nutritious for nature or industries. As it burns fuel, the water vapor and its emissions could be captured, turned back into water, and made use of." Now that's page 179. See, this is a design philosophy, and it can be applied to any field with great effect. Now my thought, as I read this chapter, because I'm an educator, is how can we apply the 5 steps to eco-effectiveness in order to create a more effective classroom or school? Surely the principles, being basic principles, could have relevance to creating a more sustainable and just educational environment. And after all, aren't we humans part of biological and technical cycles? And aren't our schools major products of civilization's attempt to help humans work better within those cycles? What stood out for me as I read the chapter is how poorly our schools really function, and made me see that this is probably as much a design flaw as it is because of political manipulation or ignorance. And if it is primarily a design flaw, well, then we can more easily fix it, since dealing with political ambitions and conquering ignorance are among the most difficult tasks we face as a species. Perhaps we could kill at least 2 birds with 1 stone. If we get the design of school right, and schools become more eco-effective because of what they were ostensibly created to do, we might more easily conquer ignorance. Our founding fathers of this fragile democracy believed that an informed citizenry was the antidote to political turmoil and to keeping tyranny in check. So perhaps redesigning our schools according to the 5 steps to eco-effectiveness can help solve that problem too. So how might we go about it? Well, the first step the book suggested is step 1, get free of known culprits, here on page 166. What does that mean? In the context of manufacturing, the authors talk about turning away from known toxins like substances, quote, that are widely recognized as harmful, end quote. But they caution us to beware of the potential absurdity of assuming that just because something poisonous has been removed, the product is therefore safe. They write, quote, "The detergent may be free of phosphates, but have they been replaced by something worse? The solvents that bind conventional printing inks are derived from problematic petrochemicals, but switching to a water base to make the product solvent-free may simply make it easier for the heavy metals that are still in the inks to enter the ecosystem. Bear in mind that positively selecting the ingredients of which a product is made and how they are combined is the goal," end quote. Now, how to achieve the healthy end goal isn't always obvious in the use of chemistry. Applying this to schooling may be even less obvious. An example from my own childhood. In the 7th grade, I learned with some joyous anticipation that we were going to get a new middle school that was supposed to be far superior to the one I had been attending for the last 3 years. The claim was that it would be more energy efficient than the drafty, if beautiful, old brick building from the 1800s that we knew, which was a marvelous sight from the outside, but had so many ornate windows that it cost a lot to heat in the winter. We were also told that it would be more progressive, replacing the traditional classrooms that kept us all divided into social classes in little boxes as much as content classes. The honors students had their rooms and the remedial students had theirs. And replace it with an open floor design that had no walls, just dividers, and could be endlessly reconfigured to suit different purposes, allowing instructors to pool classes together when desired and isolate when desired. On paper, it sounded terrific. It would be free of the known culprits of fixed classist design because it could be reconfigured to suit the more open-minded policies of the years following the end of the Vietnam War and the success of civil and environmental justice movements. And it would attend to our recent Earth Day consciousness. Destroying the beautiful old building was considered a necessary sacrifice, a sacrifice that we could make to achieve better end goals. In reality, when we showed up in September of my 8th grade, we were horrified to find that what we had been seduced into was a cost-cutting asylum built like a fortress using the worst principles of brutalist design. It was and remains to this day an impersonal concrete monolith with only a few narrow-tinted windows on the second floor that the administration covered with butcher paper. Their argument and the architect's rationale, besides saving energy, was that teachers have always had such a hard time keeping the attention of their students. What if we could design a building that not only kept heating and cooling costs down, to say nothing of building costs without all those expensive windows and penetrations, but could keep kids from being distracted by inconvenient things like sunshine, blue skies, birds, trees, and nature. Too many kids had spent too many idle hours staring out the windows and daydreaming until the teacher rapped them on the knuckles with a ruler and barked, "Pay attention or I'll send you to the principal's office." We found ourselves in the shuttered mausoleum bathed in flickering and sickly purplish green fluorescent light. And they had saved so much money by eliminating the internal walls and providing flimsy mobile partitions that they refused to listen to the complaints of families that first year, like ours, telling them what chaos was erupting in the learning areas each day. They'd provided a sickly, smelly orange carpet, obviously off-gassing the same toxins that McDonough talks about in the book, to damp down the noise. Our old 19th century school building had beautiful and nice-smelling oak wood floors. But it didn't help. Students felt so agitated by this alien planet that we had been marooned on that behavioral problems were exacerbated to extremes I'd never seen. I do remember Dean Schwartz and David Weissman once setting the chemistry lab on fire in fits of hysterical giggles. It was a year of madness set in a human zoo. This is the strongest example I've experienced of the law of unintended consequences, except that I now suspect they weren't wholly unintended. After teaching for 33 years, I'm now convinced that such moves are anticipated by the political architects of our school systems, who see them as great ways to keep talented young people out of the labor force and babysit them into inevitably immature mob behavior that can be manipulated later by sending them into armed forces or into the arms of gangs, and eventually into mobs that can be rallied to storm our capital. So getting rid of windows and getting rid of walls and getting rid of arbitrary separations between classes was not truly, quote, getting rid of the culprit, as McDonough calls it. The culprit that we must get rid of in education as our first principle is the culprit of scholastic homogeneity, of supposed standards, of teaching to the test, of grading individuals, of passing judgment and passing students, of separating communities into factions, dividing us into competing teams like the honors and gifted kids versus the remedial and average and failure kids. The culprit is the maintenance of the old world order of feudal hierarchy in our brave new world, continuing to produce alphas and betas and epsilons and gammas, only with more effective technologies that exacerbate classism, racism, genderism, and all the other forms of discrimination and injustice. So our first step is eliminate the culprit. I've started my classes by eliminating quizzes and exams. Gone. They're prime suspects in dividing people. Now, this isn't to say that there's no purpose or place for diagnostic materials that can tell each of us what we have been able to retain unaided by external memory devices and without help from others, and how well we can articulate ideas within a certain time frame in isolation, but Like medical exams that your doctor does with you, not to you, such tests would only be used to help you, the student, the patient, gauge how much you're improving at a given testable skill. Tests in my classes have never been used to judge somebody or grade them, and they are certainly not standardized because every individual is different and comes into a class and at a subject in their own unique way with their own unique perspectives and life experiences. With standardized testing out of the way as one of the major culprits in creating an unjust, unsustainable psychological atmosphere in school, we were free to explore the options for our liberty and justice for all end goal. Constructing a better school system in the absence of exams may seem daunting, but fortunately, this book gives us specific steps to start with regarding the second of the principles. The book tells us that the next part of our journey toward sustainability and justice is to, step 2, follow informed personal preferences, page 168. The authors write, in the early 1980s, quote, when Bill McDonough was designing the first of the so-called green offices for the Environmental Defense Fund national headquarters, he sent questionnaires to manufacturers whose products he was considering using, asking them to explain exactly what the products contained. The questionnaires came back saying, in essence, it's proprietary, it's legal, go away. In the absence of data from the manufacturers themselves, Bill and his colleagues had to make choices based on a limited amount of information. When Bill began dealing with these issues as an architect in the 1970s and 80s, he believed his job was to find the right things to put together, and he thought those things were already somewhere in the world. The problem was simply to then find what and where they were. But it didn't take him long to discover that few truly eco-effective components for architecture and design actually existed, and he began to see that he could help make them. The truth is that we are standing in the middle of an enormous marketplace filled with ingredients that are largely undefined. End quote, page 168, 169. Now, the same turns out to be true of the dysfunctional school system. Ultimately, you have got to make the new school system yourselves. Or rather, we have to make the new school system ourselves. We, the people. And this is part of the larger project of making that more perfect union, our beloved country, which demands our cooperative and creative vision right now. Since we are in school together, this is the design issue we can tackle together. Sometimes it is about mashing up and putting together components that are already out there, but may not have been brought into the school design context, like McDonough and Braungart's principles of eco-effectiveness. And sometimes it's about creating new strategies, techniques, ideas, and products that have never before existed. This is why we demand and reward such creativity in our classes. We want you to develop your problem-solving and critical thinking skills. We do not want you to merely parrot whatever dogma or propaganda or demagoguery we may spout in front of the classroom as teachers, preachers, authority figures. That's why our relational summaries are really about you. Now, you may feel a bit intimidated putting your all into this endeavor coming from your previous trauma with judgment. When you think you're not yet perfect, students often shrink into the background and silence themselves, refusing to participate, never asking questions or raising their hands, hiding in the back of the classroom, keeping their cameras off in Zoom calls and team calls, etc. But in a class that is eco-effective, we never want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And as our book reminds us, quote, making real-life decisions comes down to comparing two things that are both less than ideal, page 170. The authors use this statement in the context, of course, of choosing between, quote, petrochemical fabrics and cotton. But the notion applies just as well to choosing between ways of assessing student performance in school. I prefer the relational summary method that I have devised and implemented over the past 12 years. I find it far superior to the typical use of term papers and exams. However, I should point out, in all fairness, that I consider all forces of compulsory schooling to be less than ideal. The fact that many of you come to your schoolwork filled with a sense of dread and anxiety, no matter how fun or rewarding it can end up being, tells us there's something wrong with the way we do schooling something rotten in the state of Denmark, to quote Shakespeare. I consider quizzes and exams and term papers to be the educational analog of petrochemical fabrics, and my weekly relational summaries to be analogous to natural cotton. The former are decidedly toxic, while the latter feels more comfortable and breathes better. The problem is that just as cotton is grown with terrible pesticides and herbicides and uses and contaminates far too much water and is created using an unsustainable monocropping till agriculture method that depletes the soil over the long term, even the best curriculum forcing student outcomes really ends up ingraining McGregor's Theory X of human management into student consciousness rather than instilling Theory Y or Z, which are far superior, and depletes student motivation over the long term. Remember that, as the Harvard Business Review delineates, quote, Theory X assumes that people dislike work and must be coerced, controlled, and directed toward organizational goals. Furthermore, most people prefer to be treated this way so they can avoid responsibility, end quote, while, quote, Theory Y, the integration of goals, emphasizes the average person's intrinsic interest in his or her work, his or her desire to be self-directing and to seek responsibility, and his or her capacity to be creative in solving business problems, end quote. Now, it is very hard to transition students who've grown up mired in a Theory X environment to a Theory Y appreciation of your natural intrinsic capabilities for self-direction, responsibility, and creative capacity. Most of you don't even believe that Theory Y may apply to your circumstances and capabilities. And often we'll hear students say, oh, no, not me. I'm not creative. I need to be told what to do. The necessary compromise that I've fallen into in my courses to help with the rebirth or renaissance, that means rebirth in French, of intrinsic motivation and personal engagement with the world and with the scientific and academic perspectives that we take on it, has been the offer to you to create summaries of the materials you confront in our courses that relate to you so that you discover your stake in the matters at hand. But at the end of the day, come on, we have to stop trying to compel people to read and discuss the content of our classes, particularly in courses related to the psychology and application of environmental sustainability, justice perspectives, and technologies. These courses are so important to human survival and well-being that the very idea that we must threaten people into discussing the ideas they contain is tragic. But that leads us to the three other elements of cradle-to-cradle design that must be incorporated into the vital step of following informed personal preferences, which is at the heart of a relational summary approach. They are: 1. Prefer ecological intelligence, described on page 171. 2. Prefer respect, described on page 172. And 3. Prefer delight, celebration, and fun, described on page 173. Now imagine if we applied them to the classroom. In the first instance, an application of preference for ecological intelligence would reveal something I learned as an inner-city high school teacher working with gang kids in the early 1990s when I read the book Primates in the Classroom, An Evolutionary Perspective on Children's Education by J. Gary Bernard. The first half of his excellent book is just classic biological anthropology primatology, surveying the upbringing of monkeys and apes and the commonalities we all share. The second half is enlightening. He applies these ideas to the classroom, showing just how out of sync with our evolutionary history and adaptive instincts the modern school has become, with devastating consequences for students and teachers alike. And when I redesigned my classroom and schedule to be in alignment with evolutionary psychology and ecological intelligence, for example, back then only lecturing when the shades were drawn and we were sitting in a circle and a campfire simulating light was providing a warm glow to illuminate our faces, only lifting the shades and turning on the lights when the students were expected to move about the room and socialize while hunting and gathering information from the learning stations that I'd set up around the perimeter, the results were dramatic. Storytelling time by the fire creates an attention structure of respect, causes a hush to fall on the crowd, Every theater designer knows this. Bright lights excite people into movement. You can't force primates to sit still in the full light of day. Ecological intelligence is the smarts that humans developed in our ecology. You fight it at your peril. Now, prefer respect then becomes more than just hacking atavistic tropes to get students to respect the authority figure. It becomes the cause of mutual respect, honoring that every member of the tribe has something to offer the collective. It does even more wonders than atmosphere and can be carried into any environment. Prefer delight, celebration, and fun then becomes self-evident. Freed from the arbitrary or poorly explained reasons for forcing student attention on the sage on the stage, especially when the play he is performing in his role as teacher can be so poorly designed or delivered, students tend to fall back into the patterns of playful engagement that all mammals and birds, and particularly primates, instinctively use to learn serious survival. Remember that play evolved as the most efficient way to get an education long before our massive brains came on the scene. If learning doesn't produce delight and celebration and fun, it may not be authentic, deep learning. We then move on to step 3, creating a passive positive list, talked about on page 173. Quote, "This is the point," say the authors, "at which design begins to become truly eco-effective. We look at the entire palette of materials used in a given product and ask, what, if any, are their problematic or potentially problematic characteristics?" End quote. Can you imagine if educators created and discussed with their students the X list of practices and outcomes neither of us finds helpful and that are actually destructive, and considered the gray list of things that might have some value but still caused issues to arise, and then settled in on an agreed upon P list or preferred list? Recall from the discussion on page 174, 175 that drawing on the P list doesn't involve radical changes, like in our case the modern unschooling movement, which does have its merits, given that humans have an instinctive desire to learn meaningful things that can be applied to improving our welfare, and we really don't need school. We can't get to successful unschooling until we've repaired what we've done to the human spirit through our poorly designed schools. So the P list is, to quote McDonough on page 175, our positive list, sometimes referred to as our preferred list. It includes substances or practices actively defined as healthy and safe for use. But he says, for the moment, passive redesign of the product stays within its current framework of production. We are simply analyzing our ingredients and making substitutions where possible, aiming to select as many ingredients in the product as possible from the P list. We are rethinking what the product is made of, not what it fundamentally is or how it is marketed and used. And this is important because we're going to move beyond the P list when we start reinventing, but you got to start from somewhere. And the point is that for educational systems, just as with industrial systems, we haven't even begun to eliminate the bads and thoroughly weighted the grays, much less co-determined the incremental common sense positive steps that we could be taking that would get wide agreement and could be implemented without much disruption. What is left once we have done so, and that would involve hearing from and respecting all stakeholders. After all, when was the last time you were asked to help co-design your own optimal school experience? What is left once we've done that is step 4, activate the damn positive list. Page 177 explores how, and then moves us on to the final and most creative step that will naturally emerge once we've replaced bads with goods. That would be step 5, reinvent. As they say on page 178, this final step, quote, has no absolute end point, and the results may be an entirely different kind of product than the one you began to work on. But it will be an evolution of that product in the sense that it addresses the limitations you became aware of as you moved through the previous steps. Design is based on the attempt to fulfill human needs, evolving technical and cultural context. We begin by applying the active positive list for existing things, but then to things that are only beginning to be imagined or have not yet been conceived. When we optimize, we open our imaginations to radically new possibilities. We ask, what is the consumer's need? How is the culture evolving? And how can these purposes be met by appealing to them and by different kinds of products and services? End quote, page 180. Now, for far too long, school systems have been supply-driven rather than demand-driven, with an inelastic market based on a captive audience. I want to say that again, a captive audience. They've been modeled in large part, at least where public schools are concerned, after prisons and after Jeremy Bentham's panopticon insane asylum. And the consumer's needs, have mostly been ignored under the arrogant assumption that the designers knew better. That the designers knew better what learners need to know how to function in society, their society, that unsustainable, unjust society that is on its way out like so many foolish civilizations before it and is on its way to collapse. Now, I can't claim to know what's good for you, but I'm convinced that the 5 guiding principles of ecological design that McDonough and Braungart spell out on page 181 can get us to a place where at least all of us have a shot at getting a great education. And so, because this is my domain in the area of life I and you can affect directly right now, this minute, this class, this school is our environment. And if we can't apply eco-effective principles here, we probably will fail out there in the post-school world. So demand and seize your chance to co-create your learning environments and to apply these 5 guiding principles in your own life, your school life. As he says, signal your intention, i.e., commit to a new paradigm rather than to an incremental improvement of the old. Restore, i.e., strive for good growth, not just economic growth. Be ready to innovate further, which means remember that perfection of an existing product is not necessarily the best investment. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Understand and prepare for the learning curve, which means change is difficult, messy, and takes extra materials and time. Exert intergenerational responsibility. Now, that last principle, explains the website Learning Architecture, quote, and the end of the chapter, focuses on the value of ownership with some beautiful logic in the form of a quote from Thomas Jefferson to James Madison, "The earth belongs to the living," meaning contemporary generations should not create debt of any form to be paid by succeeding generations, end quote. The 5 principles really do exhibit a beautiful logic, don't they? I suspect that they would be truths that were self-evident to all people if they were uncorrupted by the present school system and its attempt to control human thought to conform to the profits of the few rather than the well-being of the many. But here we are in school, and we can't go back and fix things in the past. But we can learn to see the beauty of their life-affirming logic and apply them here and now, in school and outside of school. After all, these may be the most important lessons we ever learn.